Throughout the last 35 years, the Megami Tensei franchise has created one of the most unique gaming experiences, resulted in a growing and devoted fanbase. Renowned for its unique narrative style, charming gameplay, and philosophical notions are some of the franchise's most recognizable features that have helped it spawn a number of spin-offs and sub-series, only adding to its legacy. And thanks to the increase of interest due to Persona, in addition to the recent releases of Shin Megami Tensei I and Soul Hackers 2, we're now starting to see a decorated franchise generate new attention and finally get the global recognition it's deserved for so many years. But with so many games in the entire franchise, many are left wondering which ones are worth playing and, well, which ones should remain on the shelf, and hopefully we'll be able to answer that question. Welcome to Aligning Megami Tensei, a video series where we take a look at each Megami Tensei game one by one, ranking them from best to worst using this tier chart. With so many games in the franchise's history, this project is going to take a while to complete, so make sure to subscribe to stay up to date with each entry. I can't think of a better way to start off this video series than by taking a look at Shin Megami Tensei I, released in 1992 on the Super Famicom. While it's not the first entry in the Megami Tensei franchise, Shin Megami Tensei I would expand upon the basic game mechanics and conceptual groundwork of its predecessor games, transforming them into the fundamental building blocks that would be utilized and inspire future Megami Tensei titles. Shin Megami Tensei 1 can easily be viewed as the game that molded the franchise into what it's known as today. Its forward-thinking narrative, one-of-a-kind mechanics, inventive alignment system, an unforgettable soundtrack, and matchless art design are just a few of the elements that make the game so special. Although packed with innovative features that enhance its narrative, there are a number of what I would call oddities spread throughout the game's mechanics, pacing, and characters in general. But thanks to emulation, some of these setbacks can be avoided. If anything, these issues more so highlight the fact that Shin Megami Tensei 1 is a product of its time that fell short of modern expectations. Even with some glaring flaws, it's clear that a lot of effort was put into making sure that the game's mechanics complemented the plot and its difficult concepts that make the game so compelling. Shin Megami Tensei 1's story, atmosphere, setting, and philosophies were the driving factors that set the game apart from other releases at its time, and still hold up strongly to this day. Breaking away from the oversaturated fantasy game market at the time, and instead thriving on the novelty of its fresh start in a contemporary world, create one of the most surreal game experiences I've come across from a game of its generation, and even modern games. From the push of the start button, you find yourself in the view of our nameless protagonist in a dreamlike state, wandering through a dark maze. The game's bizarre undertones and atmosphere are immediately established, grabbing the player's attention and holding it until the very end. You'll be introduced to three morally conflicting characters, otherwise known as heroes, who will periodically accompany you throughout the story, urging you to confront your convictions, choose your fate, and by extension, the course of the world. This is otherwise known as your alignment, one of the unique features of the Shin Megami Tensei games. In Shin Megami Tensei 1, there are three alignments: Law, Chaos, and Neutral, one for each character introduced in our dream, meaning that there are three separate stories to follow with their own distinctive ending. It's safe to say that somebody's gonna die, and it better not be you. But it most likely will a number of times. As the narrative begins to set, you slowly watch Tokyo diminish into an obliterated state as demons begin to infest the city, and an international conflict between America and Japan is instigated, as the desire to control these demons becomes imminent. With the conflict being pushed past the point of mutual resolution, a nuclear strike is ordered on Tokyo, turning it into a devastated wasteland. Your party returns 30 years later, finding two groups fighting over the resume of their respective deities. It's at this point where dialogue exchanges with our heroes begin to play a more vital role in the story, with their ideologies taking the forefront of the conversations. Each interaction will slowly shift your protagonist towards an alignment, not only steering the course of the plot, but influencing many of the gameplay mechanics, bringing a new dynamic to the game. It's important to note that the player is never pushed towards a specific alignment, instead allowing them to choose their own philosophy while remaining the main hero regardless of the chosen path. I learned to both appreciate and reject this, as unlike some of the more recent game releases where restrictions based on your alignment are less draining, Shin Megami Tensei 1's alignment system left me often wondering if my in-game decision was best for me as a player. Not only does your alignment alter the outcome of the game, but the benefits and drawbacks that a route can offer are heavily stressed. Groups and demons who share similar stances will extend welcome arms and favorable treatment, whereas those who do not will do the opposite. If you manage to stay neutral, you won't really come across many of the issues that I'm pointing out, But for me, I usually tend to always pick the Chaos route on my first playthrough, so I found myself struggling a bit at times. While these perks and disadvantages are still present in modern releases, they don't feel as restrictive compared to Shin Megami Tensei I's. Regarding character interactions, as they become more prevalent, the black and white disparity between many of the characters and their responses felt one-dimensional at times. And although this might be the case, it brought validity to the points of reason for the Law and Chaos heroes, intensifying the deeply uneasy dilemma. Being that this was essentially a retelling of Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei II, there was already a clear vision with where the story was meant to go, giving the developers the opportunity to emphasize on the themes within the game. The heavy emphasis on themes like religion, faith, war, life and death, and the implications of one's actions, whether they feel morally justified or not, were seen as controversial yet groundbreaking components that made the game differentiate itself further. They would also ultimately lead to the game's own demise in terms of global success, as its mature and sensitive subject matter prevented any form of a Western release. That, on top of breaking several of Nintendo's and Sony's content policy guidelines, stalled any true future port. Still to this day, an accessible version of Shin Megami Tensei I does not exist, at least in terms for the Western audience. From a personal standpoint, I believe that these controversies, in addition to the gloomy imagery, discomfort from the plot, and unethical challenges, are what defines the entire franchise and overcomes any minor flaws. However, beyond its story and debated concepts, the game delivers creative gameplay in an unparalleled setting, even though it occasionally feels incomplete at times. The game will have you playing from two different points of view, depending on what you're doing. While exploring dungeons or engaging in combat, everything will be shown from a first-person perspective. Outside in the open world, you'll be displayed from an isometric view with a simple icon set to represent your character. This icon is a straightforward concept that helps the player distinguish the open world's light exploration atmosphere and the first person's more serious nature while dungeon crawling and in battle. The early linear sense of the game will gradually fade, giving you the flexibility to explore the surrounding areas. Although the liberty to roam free is usually a welcome trait, an absence of in-game guidance will lead to a lot of backtracking and aimless wandering. This can also lead to events happening out of order and preventing others from triggering, which leads to even more backtracking. This is where one of my biggest points of criticism comes into play, as the lack of directions caused the game's pacing to feel inconsistent as parts of the story tended to drag when orders were vaguely given. Shin Megami Tensei I doesn't necessarily go towards a directionless route, as directions are given. The message just isn't as clear as one might hope, as it's up to the player to decipher what they need to do or where they might need to go. Whether the information comes from the original source or hints from one of the patrons at the local bar, it's never enough to give the player the confidence on the task that needs to be done. And just on a side note, having to inform the bartender 3 times that you don't want a drink just because there are 3 heroes in your party isn't very fun. Although this isn't the sole reason for its problems with pacing, it's probably the most noticeable. Factoring in the game's unpolished navigation system and an encounter rate that's through the roof, there are several moments where you'll feel like little progress is being made. Moving on to the dungeons, aside from the skewed encounter rates which we'll talk about soon, I honestly have a really conflicted stance overall. On one hand, there are a few dungeons that I absolutely loved, yet there were several other dungeons that I ran across issues no matter what. Many dungeons and underground areas suffer from bland and repetitive color schemes with no unique markings to help find your way around. I also had trouble with my eyes adjusting due to the scrolling. One thing that I want to show appreciation for is that whether I thought the dungeon design was good or bad, the overall atmosphere of the game always found a way to influence each dungeon, which is a huge win in my book. Graphically, the game is fine outside of the dungeon issue. There isn't much animation going on, and that's okay. There is a matchless presence when it comes to the visual style of the demon design and scenery in Shin Megami Tensei I that's so hypnotizing. The over-sexualized designs, in addition to the religious and mature themes, are another aspect that probably resulted in its Japan-only release. Being able to see depictions of hundreds of mythological creatures from various backgrounds adds a special uniqueness that you're likely not to find in any other game. This, of course, can and will be said for most Megami Tensei games, but I feel that the pixelated artwork brings an unrivaled charisma to this game that even some of the latest releases can't imitate. Which is saying a lot when you look at some of the demon designs from the most recent titles, especially Shin Megami Tensei V. With that in mind, it'd be crazy not to bring light to Shin Megami Tensei I's remarkable soundtrack. Whether it's the intensity and adrenaline of a battle, the surreal moment and disbelief as Tokyo is destroyed, the eagerness and thrill of an adventure, or something entirely different, the music's ability to capture the specific mood and tone in each track feels so on point. And it's even more impressive when you consider that this is Tsukasa Masako's first time creating music for the Super Famicom. The combat and party system are easily the heaviest elements of gameplay. They also happen to be the highest of highs and lowest of lows. Combat is a mixture of your traditional turn-based style for a game of its time, with its own twists and flares thrown in. Normal commands such as attacking, defending, and running away are all present, and the addition of talking to demons to recruit or negotiate with them are also incorporated. Your protagonist is limited to physical attacks or using a gun, while other party members can use spells to exploit enemy weaknesses, cure ailments, and heal when necessary. This adds a level of strategy, as the player must find a way to rely on their fluctuating party. There will initially be some trial and error since each skill's function isn't really described. It won't take long to realize that some skills perform far more effectively than others, drawing attention to some of the combat-related disparities. Like any standard JRPG from its time, enemy encounters are random. At the beginning of a battle, an enemy icon will show up near the top of the screen to indicate the number of enemies and their status. To my knowledge, unless there are two different demons, the player can't select which enemy to target, prolonging some battles more than necessary. And speaking of enemy encounters, the game's most glaring and overwhelming issue comes from its absurdly high encounter rate. What's odd is that you'll come across specific regions that I would say have a fair encounter rate, while other areas won't even allow you to walk more than 2 steps before you run into another wave of enemies. While the high encounter rate does cause numerous issues, most enemy encounters really don't pose much of a threat. This isn't to say that you won't die. You will, a lot. Mostly from unforeseen one-shots during the early stages of entering a new area. Depending on the version that you're playing, save points are very few, so make sure to save when you can and push through. While not always the most accessible, it's best to purchase weapon and armor upgrades at the shops in each town to give you a fighting chance from the waves of enemies you'll come across. Once you feel that you and your party are at a comfortable level, you can just auto-battle your way through most encounters. And there are a few overpowered strategies that can be used to lower your chances of taking significant damage, even in the highest encounter zones. After I came to realize that demon allies in my party were mostly buff bots, while the protagonist and other heroes dealt most of the damage, it was pretty smooth sailing for me. I should also mention that these overpowered strategies unfortunately carry over to a good number of boss fights, making some build-ups to the bosses feel a tad underwhelming. Despite the high encounter rate, gaining experience isn't as generous as one would think. While it doesn't feel like a chore, I never felt that my actual level reflected the number of hours that I would pour into some areas. This really isn't too much of an issue, as I still managed to push through the hordes of enemies regardless of what my level was. And once the protagonists and heroes level up, stat points can be distributed to one of 6 attributes, making combat much quicker. I gotta say though, Shin Megami Tensei I's encounter rate really makes me question whether the game is testing my party's strength or my patience. At some points, I found myself hypnotized by the waves of enemies, and at others, I nearly quit playing. Yet, there were so many parts of the game that kept me through the frustrations. The ability to recruit demons through measures of bartering and persuasion, to then take those demons to fuse them into a stronger being, were addictive features that helped alleviate the stress caused by the game's poor in-game guidance and high encounter rate. These features have become pinnacles of the franchise and are a large reason why so many compare Shin Megami Tensei to an adult version of Pokemon. With your party being a revolving group of demons with periodic reunions with the heroes, the player is given full responsibility to assemble a team that not only meets their standards, but also that of the game, as your alignment will have an impact on the number of recruitable demons and fusion options, causing them to significantly decrease as you progress further into the story. And because demons don't level up, they're fairly expendable, emphasizing the value of frequently recruiting and fusing for new demons. One thing that I couldn't get behind in the party system was the implemented pay per step system. The idea of paying to summon demons is reasonable to me. However, maintaining demons with a pay per step system felt like an unnecessary addition, especially in the early parts of the game. Later, money and magnitude become abundant, and most times there's no reason for keeping more than one demon in your active party outside of boss battles. But it's still a concept I wish they revisited before releasing the game. Recruiting demons is difficult in Shin Megami Tensei I, especially compared to the more recent releases. It's unpredictable, luck is needed, demons always request the one item you don't have, your alignment plays a heavy factor, and I always tell Jack Frost he can get with the babes. But I love the challenge of this feature and actually prefer this over the newer releases. I think it does a good job expressing the erratic nature of what it would actually be like to try and recruit a demon. Okay, maybe that's a stretch, but you get the point. With that in mind, some demons are fusion exclusive. This makes fusing seem like an attractive feature, and it is to a degree. The concept of merging demons to create what feels like at times an infinite variety of possible combinations serves to underline how crucial it is to assemble and rearrange your party. And later entries were able to make fusion a simple and personalized process while maintaining the same sense of intrigue and wonder of what's out there. However, I can't say I hold the same feelings towards Shin Megami Tensei I's fusion as I do with the more recent releases. I wouldn't necessarily say it's bad, but it felt rough around the edges overall. I still used it on occasion, but it ended up being my most neglected feature of the entire game. Your alignment might prevent you from bringing in a new ally, but if it does, you can always escape, negotiate for items or money, or just kill the demon. But as my alignment grew stronger throughout the course of the game, Demon Fusion only seemed to present me with new obstacles. And maybe this is also caused by the lack of instructions on how to really take advantage of this system, but there are still other options that really stop Fusion from being great. These alignment limitations, combined with the clunkiness of the menu layout, just really couldn't justify the results of the demon options that were available. And if I wasn't getting a demon much weaker than the ones currently in my party, I was getting one way above my protagonist's level, preventing me from fusing altogether. After 3 or 4 failed attempts, I just gave up and went back to recruiting. Having said that, when you do find an option that works, it feels like one of the most rewarding experiences in the game. I think this is mostly a result of the animation sequence, as it's so visually appealing that it made me want to keep searching for other possibilities. Learning how to take advantage of the 3 demon fusion option, or combining 2 demons from the same family to raise its rank, are also neat additions that help address some of the issues. Additionally, as you level up, your selections will expand, sparking some curiosity in what might be available. Although I found fusion occasionally fulfill its purpose, it's by far the hardest mechanism to master in the game, and felt like a less desirable alternative for recruiting additional party members. Without getting into too much of spoilers, I want to briefly highlight the endings and share my opinions on them. If you haven't already played Shin Megami Tensei I yet, or don't want to be spoiled on something in particular, then click here for the wrap up and ranking of this review. I'll also put timestamps for each ending individually if there's one that you're interested in. With 3 specific endings to its game and a higher focus on the combat and party elements of the gameplay, it comes as no surprise that the characters and final product of their alignment leaves a bit to be desired compared to other titles. Each ending has its own unique points and strengths, but there's clearly a pecking order in terms of quality. Starting off with probably the weakest is the Law ending. As a whole, taking the Law route felt like the most underwhelming of the 3, most likely a result of its too close to home cliched hero and the easiest boss fights of the bunch. There are some neat highlights to the Law hero, such as his death, but this feels massively underplayed and is a core plot to the story. Following that, we have the Chaos route. While only being marginally better than the Law route, the impression from the endings that transpire align fairly well with the character representing the alignment and his overall goals. With the Chaos hero struggling with his lack of strength throughout the story's progression, we finally get to witness him obtain this power that he's been seeking the entire time, essentially doing a complete 180 from the position he was in at the very opening scene. Additionally, the stronger challenges from the end bosses and a more interesting premise, the Chaos route ultimately was most likely unpredictable at the time of its release, but falls short in terms of today's titles. Last but not least, we have the neutral ending. Considered the strongest of the 3 and regarded as the canon ended by the developers of the game, the neutral route is the most challenging to align with. What's more is that this essentially provides the greatest challenge in terms of combat, as you'll be up against all bosses representing both Law and Chaos, essentially meaning more gameplay for the player. From a personal perspective, I enjoyed the ambiguity as to what transpires next. It's far more interesting and provides nearly any setup for a sequel game, which obviously was released down the line. On a final note, there is a minigame in Tokyo Destiny Land that can be used to adjust your alignment. I found this to be a pretty odd addition, as basically all my decisions prior seem pretty much pointless, but that's just me nitpicking at this point of the review. Regardless of whatever route chosen, the plot doesn't diverge that much and the same major events take place. Players will find that the most notable changes, outside of the ones just mentioned, will revolve around the dialogue exchanges, as well as prevent recruitment of opposing demons if you switch sides. And while I say that Shin Megami Tensei I's endings overall leave the most to be desired compared to the other Shin Megami Tensei installments, you'll still find enjoyment from the number of other mechanics and the story's overall premise. Shin Megami Tensei I is definitely an experience. A fun, often frustrating one. While clearly not the most polished game in the series, let alone for a game of its time, there's almost nothing that compares to its surreal moments and ominous tones that are displayed throughout the entirety of its playthrough. Bits of the game are brought down by its pacing and abnormal encounter rates, but there are so many good qualities in its story, artwork, music, and recruiting that overshadow these and make the game a worthwhile experience. And I can only imagine the justice a proper remake could do for this game's reputation. Although that's highly unlikely, a man can hope though. Does this mean I think Shin Megami Tensei 1 is for everyone? Well, no. Newcomers to the franchise will probably give up fairly quickly, but JRPG, Megaten, and Dungeon Crawler enthusiasts would have a blast with this. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Shin Megami Tensei 1 was the building blocks for this series, and I think it would be a shame if you didn't at least try and play it at some point. As for where Shin Megami Tensei 1 will be placed on this tier chart, I could make an argument for a low B, but I gotta go with C for now. But that wraps up my review for Shin Megami Tensei 1. If you have a game in the series that you want me to review, make sure to post it in the comments below. Also, let me know what you guys think about Shin Megami Tensei 1 in general. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video as well, and I'll see you in the next one.